Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're here to explore those really complex, tangled moments in history, especially where ideas and people collide in fascinating ways. Today, we're looking at a pretty amazing journey, actually. It connects an Italian Marxist thinker, Antonio Gramsci, writing from a prison cell, with a Scottish soldier, poet, and, folk music champion, Hamish Henderson. And all this is happening against the backdrop of, the mid 20th century, a really challenging time politically. So our main focus is Hamish Henderson. He lived from 1919 right through to 2002, a real polymath, you could say. Scotland's leading folklorist, a respected poet, songwriter, activist, even a decorated soldier from the Desert War, often called the father of the Scottish folk revival. But what we're digging into today shows his influence went, much deeper, right into political theory.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And the theorist he championed, Antonio Gramsci, well, he's just a giant of 20th century thought, lived 1891 to 1937. An Italian revolutionary, a Marxist theorist whose most lasting work, the prison notebooks, the prison letters, he wrote them while locked up by Mussolini. You really can't discuss culture, power, class on the left without talking about Gramsci, especially that idea of cultural hegemony.
Right. So our mission for this deep dive is to look at Henderson's role. He was a real pioneer, though, often overlooked, in bringing Gramsci's ideas to the British left, specifically through translating those prison letters, which was, a difficult task in itself. But it wasn't just about translation, was it? It became the foundation, the sort of theoretical bedrock for Henderson's whole approach to cultural politics, particularly for the Scottish folk revival.
It really was. It's this incredible moment of cultural and political fusion. We're not just tracking a book being translated. We're tracking a political act, an act that gave the Scottish left and eventually, the whole UK academic world new tools to understand how national identity, class, and culture all weave together.
Okay, let's unpack this then. How does a Scottish soldier who'd been fighting fascism literally on the battlefield become the first person, really, to bring this Sardinian revolutionary's cultural ideas to the English-speaking world, decades before Gramsci became, a common name in universities? So the story kicks off not in some library, but right in the middle of World War II, or maybe just after the fighting stopped. Hamish Henderson was with the British Army in Italy. Intelligence, psychological warfare, playing a pretty key role, especially around the liberation of Florence in 1944.
And it was right there, Florence, 1944. Amidst all the chaos and excitement of liberation, that Henderson first hears the name Antonio Gramsci. Not from a professor, but from Italian partisans, his fellow fighters, communists. It wasn't about theory initially. It was about respect for a fallen hero, a martyr of the anti-fascist struggle.
That first contact, that sort of gut-level connection, that seems absolutely crucial, doesn't it, for understanding why Henderson stuck with this for so long. The sources are really clear. Gramsci appealed to him, but it wasn't Gramsci the high-flying Marxist theorist talking about cultural hegemony. Not at first, anyway. Those ideas came later.
Exactly. It was Gramsci the person, Gramsci the Sardinian, a kind of soulmate almost. Henderson, being Scottish, felt that immediate connection.
Yeah.
He saw these really striking parallels. Sardinia's relationship with mainland Italy, linguistically, culturally, politically, looked a lot like Scotland's relationship with Britain, with London.
So that feeling of being on the cultural edge, the periphery, struggling against a dominant center.
Precisely. That sense of a rich local culture being marginalized by a metropolitan power. It felt familiar.
And then there's the martyrdom aspect. Gramsci dying in Mussolini's prison. It reminded Henderson of his own hero, didn't it, John Maclean?
Yes, the great Glasgow socialist. Maclean also suffered hugely for his beliefs, imprisonment, harsh treatment. So Henderson saw Gramsci in that same heroic, almost saintly light.
And this wasn't just passive admiration. He jumped into action almost immediately.
He did. May 1947, just 2 years after the war, he gets hold of the first Italian edition of Gramsci's Lettere del Carcere, the prison letters, sent to him by an acquaintance in Rome, Amleto Micozzi.
Yep.
And Henderson starts translating them right away into English.
That's serious dedication. He wasn't waiting around for publishers or anything. He believed this was important, and he put his money where his mouth was, literally. He'd won the Somerset Maugham Award for his war poems, Elegies for the Dead in Cyrenaica. He used the prize money, plus, and I love this detail from the sources, a fortuitous win on the horses.
Yes. Incredible, isn't it? Used it all to go back to Italy and just focus entirely on translating Gramsci, betting on the importance of these letters.
So this intense period, 47 to 51, working on the translation, it must have been all-consuming.
Absolutely. It involved a lot of legwork, too. He needed to understand the context.
All right. We know he went to meet Gramsci's brother, Carlo, and also Piero Sraffa.
Sraffa, yeah.
Yeah.
Gramsci's closest friend. the one who supported him financially. Stropha later became this major economist at Cambridge. Henderson was tracking down anyone who could shed light on the letters.
But there's a catch here, isn't there? A really important bit of context about the version he was translating, the censorship issue.
Yes, absolutely crucial, and often missed. That 1947 Italian edition Henderson received, it wasn't the full picture. It had already been edited. Censored.
Okay. Censored how? What was left out?
Well, two main things. First, understandable perhaps, edits to protect family sensitivities. Gramsci's letters could be intensely personal, sometimes painful. But the bigger issue politically was the suppression of Gramsci's disagreements, his criticisms of the Communist International, the Comintern, Moscow's line, and also the Italian Communist Party, the PCI. Criticisms he made while he was in prison.
Okay. So if Gramsci was challenging the party line, even from prison, and those bits were removed, does that mean Henderson, without meaning to, introduced a slightly softer, or maybe a more party-aligned Gramsci to the UK than was really the case?
That's the big question, isn't it? The Gramsci he first presented was, by necessity, incomplete. Some of the sharp edges, particularly his critiques of Stalinism and party bureaucracy, were smoothed over in that initial Italian edition.
Still, his passion for the project, especially the cultural side, was immense. You can see what he valued most in the pitch he made to the publisher John Lehman back in 1949.
Yes, he really framed Gramsci in a specific way, not just as a political theorist, but as a rounded cultural figure. Henderson highlighted Gramsci, the theater lover, the first critic to really appreciate Pirandello, someone who admired Ibsen. He even said Gramsci anticipated George Orwell in understanding mass culture.
And he really pushed the popular culture angle, didn't he? Which ties right into Henderson's own work.
Definitely. He stressed Gramsci's insight into things like boys' own stories, westerns, pulp fiction, how Gramsci saw folk art as the natural bedrock of all culture, something to be taken very seriously.
So he wasn't selling a dry Marxist text. He was selling a humanist, someone with civic courage.
Exactly. And he even played that identity card again, describing Gramsci, the Sardinian, as having a strange Scottish mixture of hardness and softness. For Henderson, Gramsci wasn't just another intellectual. He was a kindred spirit. Maybe, as Henderson put it, one of the few truly great figures of that sorry century.
Ugh.
So Henderson finishes the translation more or less by 51, and almost immediately you see him putting these Gramscian ideas about culture to work. They become the theoretical engine, really, for his big project, the Scottish folk revival.
Right, this is where it all connects. Henderson sees Gramsci's focus on popular and folk culture as, well, the perfect justification for promoting traditional Scottish music and song, which, at the time, let's be honest, was often looked down on, seen as quaint, backward, not serious culture.
Precisely. Gramsci gave him the intellectual framework. Folk culture wasn't just nostalgic fluff. It was an alternative perspective. The subaltern view, Gramsci called it, a view from below, challenging the official story, the bourgeois narrative pushed by the establishment.
Henderson had that great line, didn't he? Folk art as an implicit and often explicit challenge to the ruling class way of looking at the world. It's resistance. It's memory keeping.
And because it was resistance, it had to be studied seriously, not just collected like butterflies. There's a key passage in Gramsci's prison notebooks that became almost a mission statement for Henderson and the School of Scottish Studies he helped set up in Edinburgh in '51.
What does it say?
Essentially, Gramsci argued that folklore isn't an eccentricity, an oddity, or a picturesque element. It's something very serious. It has to be studied properly.
And the goal wasn't just academic study, was it? It was much bigger.
Much bigger. The ultimate aim for Gramsci and for Henderson applying him was the birth of a new culture among the broad popular masses, breaking down that wall between high art and low folk culture.
But Gramsci wasn't just romanticizing folk culture, was he? There was a critical edge there, too.
Oh, absolutely. And this is where the nuance comes in, the challenge Henderson wrestled with. Gramsci saw folklore as the worldview of the subaltern classes, yes, but often fragmentary, unelaborated, sometimes even containing debased ideas, bits and pieces filtered down from elite culture, but maybe distorted or misunderstood.
So it's not a pure, noble tradition. It's messy. It reflects the contradictions of the people's lives.
Exactly. It's real. Gramsci wasn't saying it was perfect, but he was saying its resilience, the way it reflected lived experience, made it absolutely vital. You had to study it, understand it, engage with it. That was the starting point for any real cultural or political change. You start where people are.
And that idea that it's fragmented but resilient, always flowing, that leads to Henderson's big metaphor, doesn't it? The carrying stream.
The carrying stream. Yeah, beautiful and powerful idea, deeply Gramscian. Folk art as this constantly moving river, it's a source artists can always return to, drawing on ancient stories, tunes, feelings. But it's not static. It's always absorbing new things, changing. It allows for this constant cross-fertilization between folk and, say, literary traditions.
So tradition isn't a museum piece. It's a live, evolving, carrying culture forward.
Precisely. Flexible enough to adapt as society changes.
And Henderson didn't just theorize about this. His field work put it into practice. His work with the travelers, finding Jeannie Robertson, that validated the theory, didn't it?
Absolutely. His encounters, especially with the traveling community like the Stewarts of Blair Gowery, were critical. These were people living outside settled society, ignoring boundaries, geographical and cultural. Their repertoire was fascinating. They sang ancient ballads, sure, but also music hall hits, pop songs, things previous collectors often dismissed as impure.
Because it didn't fit the neat boxes of authentic folk.
Right. But for Henderson, armed with Gramsci, this impurity was the proof. It showed exactly what Gramsci said. People adopt songs and stories not because they're authentic in some academic sense, but because they resonate, because they conform to their way of thinking and feeling. Okay?
Yeah.
The travelers were actively shaping their own culture from below, blending traditions. It proved culture wasn't just a top-down process.
So this Gramscian framework let Henderson see the value in what others missed. It helped bridge that gap between high and low culture.
And it fed directly into his own artistic vision. That idea, borrowed from the German poet Heine. Poetry becomes people, the ideal fusion of sophisticated art and collective folk expression. But we need to jump back to the translation itself for a moment, because despite Henderson finishing it around 1951, there's this huge irony, this massive delay before it actually got published. It took decades, which meant his role as the guy who first brought Gramsci to the UK was kind of erased, or at least seriously downplayed.
It's incredible, really. Nearly 30 years. For such a significant work. The full Prison Letters translation only started appearing in the New Edinburgh Review in 1974. And the book, not until 1988, by which time loads of other academics had sort of claimed the ground of introducing Gramsci.
Exactly. A real misfortune for Henderson's legacy in that specific area. But crucially, the delay didn't stop him using the ideas. He put Gramsci into action straight away.
Yeah.
And the prime example, the big, bold move, was the Edinburgh People's Festival Sealed.
Ah, yes, the People's Festival. This was a direct challenge, wasn't it? Running alongside the official, rather staid, Edinburgh International Festival.
Absolutely deliberate. From 1951 to 54, Henderson was clear. This was for the people shut out of the main festival. Low prices, families welcome, kids running around. It was meant to be accessible, democratic.
It was basically Gramsci's ideas about popular culture made real, using folk music to build a different kind of national culture, rooted in working-class life, in tradition.
And utterly groundbreaking is the first time many of these legendary traditional singers, Flora McNeil, Jeannie Robertson, Jimmy McBeath, were heard on a public stage, bringing the carrying stream right into the heart of the capital.
It must have been electrifying, and it really kicked off the folk revival, didn't it?
It did. Culturally, it was a massive success, but its politics were unavoidable. Henderson used it as a platform. He sang songs about John McLean, the socialist hero. It was explicitly radical.
And this was peak Cold War time. That kind of radicalism wasn't going to go unnoticed.
Not at all. The backlash was swift and, frankly, brutal. It shows you the other side of hegemony, not just consent, but coercion. The Labour Party, worried about communist influence, basically branded the People's Festival a front for the CPGB, the Communist Party of Great Britain. They declared it a proscribed organization.
Wow. Proscribed organization. In 1950s Britain, that's serious. That's not just a label.
It's a political death sentence. It meant mainstream organizations had to shun it. The Scottish TUC, the Trades Union Congress, pulled its funding and support.
And without the unions,
The festival couldn't survive. It collapsed in 1954. Killed by politics, not by lack of an audience. A perfect, if tragic, illustration of Gramsci's point about the state exercising power.
So the cultural project was shut down by political force, the very thing Gramsci analyzed.
Exactly. You need more than just good ideas. You need control of the structures, the resources.
But the spirit of it, that mix of politics and folk culture, it didn't die out. You see it in Henderson's later work, especially his songwriting, The Freedom Come All Ye.
Ah, yes. Written in 1960 for peace marchers on Clydeside. That song is Poetry Becomes People. It's often talked about as an alternative national anthem for Scotland. But it's the opposite of jingoistic. It's a deeply radical internationalist Gramscian vision.
How so? What's the message?
It imagines a Scotland that owns up to its own past, its colonial criminality. It calls for racial harmony, for nuclear disarmament, for a kind of, well, a post-scarcity socialism. It's utopian.
And the tune itself adds another layer, doesn't it?
It does. The melody is from the Bloody Fields of Flanders, that mournful World War I song. It gives the whole thing this sense of yearning, like this better future is possible, but it's just out of reach, in the future, in the wind. It's profoundly political art, growing right out of that Gramscian soil Henderson cultivated. Now, Henderson's commitment to this kind of radical cultural politics meant he was often rubbing up against the establishment, even the cultural establishment. And the most famous example is his public spat, his flighting with Hugh MacDiarmid.
We should probably explain flighting for listeners. It's a great Scots word.
It is. It means a formal, often quite aggressive public dispute, usually through poems or letters. It's like an intellectual duel.
And this one, between Henderson and MacDiarmid, played out in the letters pages of the Scotsman newspaper. What was it about?
At its core, it was about that classic split, high art versus low art, and tied into that, the role of the individual genius versus the collective, the folk tradition.
MacDiarmid representing the sort of modernist elitist view, the lone poet forging a new high culture.
Exactly. He could be quite dismissive of folk forms. Whereas Henderson, championing Gramsci, argued that real cultural progress had to be rooted in the people, in that carrying stream.
So it was a clash of philosophies, elitism versus a kind of radical humanism.
That's how Corey Gibson frames it in his analysis. Henderson's Gramsci-inspired humanism versus MacDiarmid's intellectual elitism. Henderson just fundamentally rejected the idea that culture should only belong to an elite, which is pure Gramsci, focusing on the subaltern.
And it's fascinating that Henderson had these ideas cooking for decades, but it wasn't until the 70s and 80s that Gramsci really hit the mainstream in British academia, long after Henderson's initial translation.
Right. Once the political climate changed a bit and maybe better translations became available, suddenly Gramsci was everywhere, especially that concept of hegemony.
Hegemony. The idea that power isn't just force, it's also consent, getting people to buy into the ruling ideas.
Precisely. Ruling groups maintain control through a mix of coercion and consent, often won through cultural leadership. Marxist academics started using it to analyze everything, from trade unions looking at contradictory consciousness, how workers might be both anti-boss and pro-capitalism, to broader politics.
And it even seeped into popular culture, didn't it? It wasn't just stuck in universities.
No, it really resonated, especially during the Thatcher years. People used it to understand how Thatcherism gained such a grip.
You mentioned the pop group Hue and Cry.
Yeah, Pat Kane from Hue and Cry explicitly said their song Labor of Love was inspired by articles in Marxism Today about Thatcherite hegemony. How policies like selling council houses created this property-owning democracy that tied working-class interests to conservatism. That's the consent part of hegemony in action.
Getting people to agree to the system, even if it might ultimately be against their collective interest.
Exactly. And you saw it in visual art, too. Ken Curry's painting, The Self-Taught Man, from 1987, it shows a Clydeside worker reading a book, and you can just make out Gramsci on the cover. Henderson himself saw that painting and thought it was deeply significant proof that these ideas were reaching the very people Gramsci wrote about.
But with this popularity came a risk, didn't it? The risk of the ideas getting watered down.
Trivialized.
That was the critique, yes. When hegemony started being used just to mean, oh, this idea is currently popular among intellectuals, like maybe the fashionable anti-tartanry stance in Scottish cultural circles being called hegemonic, critics argued that this stripped the concept of its power. Gramsci meant hegemony as a system of class rule, secured across society, not just intellectual fashion. It risked making a serious tool seem trivial.
Which takes us back to Gramsci's core purpose. He wasn't just describing things. He was trying to find a way to challenge power. And that meant avoiding simplistic explanations. Absolutely. He fought against what he called economism, the trap of reducing everything just to economics. Thinking the economic base determines everything else automatically.
He insisted you had to look at the superstructures, too. Politics, ideology, culture.
Yes. You have to analyze their relations of force in society, how power works through institutions, ideas, culture. These things are material forces themselves, not just reflections of economics. They have to be fought over.
And his method wasn't a one-size-fits-all formula, was it? It had to be applied specifically.
Crucially, yes. Later thinkers talked about needing a Scottish prism to read Gramsci. You couldn't just import ideas from Italy or Russia, you had to analyze the concrete, specific conditions of Scotland, its history, its culture. The struggle had to be grounded.
So it's a complex, dynamic view of how change happens. It's not just about storming the factory gates. It's about winning hearts and minds, too. This cultural struggle.
And that struggle boils down to one of Gramsci's key distinctions, the difference between common sense and good sense.
Okay, what's the difference there?
Common sense is the everyday philosophy of ordinary people. It's often fragmented, contradictory, contains bits of folklore, tradition, but also bits of ruling class ideology absorbed unconsciously. It's where people are. Good sense, for Gramsci, was the goal. More coherent, critical, scientific understanding of the world, essentially. A Marxist worldview, but one arrived at through critical thought.
So the job of activists, or Gramsci's organic intellectuals, people like Henderson maybe, isn't just to impose good sense from above.
No, it's to engage with common sense, to work within it, critique it, clarify its contradictions, and help transform it into good sense. It's a process, a long, difficult cultural and ideological battle to build a counter-hegemony, a new way of seeing the world. Henderson's deep dive into folk culture was exactly that kind of engagement. #outro. So when you look back at Hamish Henderson's life and work, starting with that incredibly dedicated translation effort in the late 40s, even though it was based on a censored text, what he did was remarkable. He didn't just introduce a thinker. He pioneered the application of Gramsci's theories in Britain. He wove them into cultural action, the People's Festival, the folk revival. He really stands as a major figure in understanding cultural politics in Scotland, even if it took a long time for him to get the credit.
Yeah, and he lived those ideas. He put them into practice, often at great personal cost, like seeing the People's Festival shut down by Cold War politics.
Yeah.
He was wrestling with Gramsci in theory and in practice long before it was fashionable.
And thankfully, there's much more potential for research now. Since 2013, the University of Edinburgh Library has held a Hamish Henderson archive. It's enormous. Over 10,000 letters, notebooks, diaries, manuscripts, translation notes. It's all there for researchers to really unpack how his thinking developed, how he made that connection between Italy and Scotland.
Which brings us back maybe to a final thought. Something about Henderson's role, the intellectual engaging with the folk. It loops back to the title of that study we mentioned, The Voice of the People.
Exactly. And it leaves us with a fundamental question, one that's still incredibly relevant for cultural politics everywhere. What is the voice of the people? Is it the intellectual, the leader who speaks for the people? Or is it that collective, anonymous, evolving voice Henderson's carrying stream that the intellectual's job is simply to listen to amplify, and perhaps following Gramsci, to help clarify into good sense? That tension, well, that's still at the heart of it all.